This quarter horse was feared by everyone. Its untamed spirit and fiery eyes scared away even the most skilled trainers. But one boy wasn't afraid to take the ultimate risk, and what happened next left everyone speechless. The plain stretched endlessly, golden under the setting sun, interrupted only by the occasional cluster of wildflowers swaying in the breeze. It was a picture of serenity, yet in the distance, a storm brewed, not of thunderclouds but of raw, untamed power. The source, a lone quarter horse with a reputation as fierce as the wild landscape it called home. This horse wasn't just an animal, it was a legend. Known as Thunder, it was both admired and feared, its story etched into the very fabric of the land. For years, Thunder had evaded capture, eluding the most skilled ranchers and earning a reputation as the untouchable ghost of the plains. Its copper coat, shimmering like molten fire in the sun, became a fleeting mirage to those lucky enough to catch a glimpse. Thunder's fame wasn't just about its beauty or speed, it was the untamable spirit it carried. No one knew the full story of its past, but whispers circulated in the community. Some said it had been abandoned by a cruel owner who had tried to break its spirit with harsh methods. Others claimed it had escaped a life of captivity after a terrible accident. The truth remained a mystery, but the scars etched into Thunder's body spoke louder than words. This was no ordinary horse, it was a survivor, shaped by betrayal and forged in defiance. For the people living near the plains, Thunder had become an enigma. Ranchers spoke about it with equal parts awe and frustration, their tales growing taller with each failed attempt to capture it. "That horse isn't just wild, it's cursed," an old hand once muttered, shaking his head as he recounted the time Thunder had outsmarted a team of wranglers. Trainers with decades of experience would come to the plains, confident that their skills would be enough to tame the infamous quarter horse. They left with bruised bodies and bruised egos, their pride trampled along with their attempts. Thunder wasn't just resistant to being caught, it actively challenged anyone who tried. Its defiance was like a statement, "You don't own me. You never will." Despite this, Thunder's allure was undeniable. Children would beg their parents to drive out to the ranches just to catch a glimpse of the elusive horse. Groups would gather at a safe distance with binoculars in hand, hoping for even a momentary sighting. When Thunder ran, it was like watching a force of nature, a blur of copper and black, muscles rippling, mane flowing like a dark river in the wind. The ground seemed to shake beneath its hooves, and onlookers couldn't help but marvel at its beauty. Yet, this beauty carried an air of tragedy. Thunder was a creature of freedom, but it was also deeply alone. Herds of wild horses roamed the plains, but Thunder stayed apart, a solitary figure against the vast horizon. It was as if the horse had chosen to isolate itself, keeping its distance from anything that might threaten its hard-won independence. Many wondered what went on in the mind of such an animal. Was it lonely? Did it long for connection, for trust? Or had it truly abandoned all hope of ever finding safety in the presence of others? These questions hung in the air, unanswered, as Thunder continued its solitary existence. As time passed, the stories about Thunder grew. Its legend reached beyond the local ranches, drawing attention from journalists and filmmakers who saw the horse as a symbol of freedom and resilience. Yet, for all its fame, Thunder remained a mystery. No one had been able to get close enough to truly understand it. The closest encounter came when a group of trainers set a carefully laid trap, using a corral and bait to lure Thunder in. For a brief moment, it seemed they had succeeded. Thunder stood in the enclosure, its powerful frame silhouetted against the fading light. But before they could secure the gate, the horse erupted into a frenzy, rearing and kicking with such force that it broke through the wooden barriers, leaving the trainers stunned and empty-handed. From that day on, many gave up. "That horse isn't meant for a saddle," they said. "It's better off left alone." But there were others, those who saw something in Thunder's eyes beyond the defiance. There was pain there, buried deep, and a glimmer of something else, a longing for understanding. Among these believers was an old rancher who had spent decades working with horses. He spoke softly about Thunder, his voice carrying a mix of respect and sorrow. "That horse doesn't need taming," he said one evening by the campfire. "It needs healing. someone with the patience to listen, to show it that not all humans are enemies. But that's no easy task. It's going to take someone special. The rancher's words rang true. Thunder didn't need force, it needed trust. But who would be willing to take on such a challenge? Who would risk their safety, their pride, to approach a creature that had every reason to fear them? Unbeknownst to the ranchers and onlookers, the answer to this question was closer than they realized. Somewhere out there, a person with quiet determination and a kind heart was preparing to step into Thunder's world, not with ropes or whips, but with an understanding of what it meant to be broken and a willingness to build something new. The wild spirit of Thunder, once thought untouchable, was about to meet someone who saw it not as a challenge to conquer but as a soul to connect with. The legend of Thunder had settled over the plains like a shadow, its presence both thrilling and daunting. But Thunder wasn't just a wild horse, it was a reflection of a world that often felt unforgiving. Somewhere on the outskirts of this world, a boy named Jonah was about to step into a story that would test his courage and redefine his purpose. Jonah was no stranger to hard times. At 16, he had already lived through more loss than most adults. Growing up in the small, quiet town of Willow Bend, Jonah's life had been shaped by struggle. After losing his mother to an illness and watching his father's spirit break under the weight of grief, Jonah had learned to carry the burden of survival on his narrow shoulders. By the time he came to live with his Uncle Henry on a modest ranch, Jonah had grown quiet and withdrawn, a boy of few words but deep thoughts. His hands were calloused from endless work, and his hazel eyes carried a weariness that came from seeing too much too soon. The ranch wasn't much, a couple of barns, a field of overgrown grass, and a handful of aging horses, but it was a lifeline. Uncle Henry, a stern but kind-hearted man, did his best to teach Jonah the ways of ranch life, but the boy often found himself lost in his own thoughts, staring at the horizon as though searching for something he couldn't name. One evening, after a particularly long day of hauling hay and fixing fences, Jonah overheard Henry talking to one of the neighbors. They spoke in hushed tones about a horse no one could tame, a horse that had roamed the outskirts of Willow Bend for years. "Wildest thing I've ever seen," the neighbor said, shaking his head. "They call it Thunder. You go near it, and you're asking for trouble. Broke a man's arm last spring just for trying to corral it." Uncle Henry chuckled dryly. "Some animals are just born untouchable. That one's better off left alone." The words lingered in Jonah's mind long after the conversation ended. Something about the story stirred a strange feeling in him, not fear, but curiosity. For someone like Jonah, who had always felt out of place, the idea of an untouchable creature resonated deeply. The next morning, Jonah woke before dawn, slipping out of the small cabin he shared with Henry. The air was crisp, and the sky was painted in soft shades of blue and orange. Jonah saddled one of the older horses, a gentle mare named Sage, and set out toward the hills where Thunder was rumored to roam. The ride was long and silent, the only sounds the steady clop of Sage's hooves and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Jonah felt a mix of anticipation and doubt. What was he even doing? He didn't have a plan, just a strange pull in his chest, as though something was guiding him forward. When he reached the crest of a hill, Jonah stopped and scanned the valley below. At first, there was nothing but the endless stretch of grass and wildflowers swaying in the wind. But then, in the distance, he saw it, a lone figure moving with a grace and power that took his breath away. Thunder. The horse was unlike anything Jonah had ever seen. Its coat was a deep chestnut, gleaming in the sunlight like polished copper. Its mane flowed wildly, and its movements were a perfect blend of strength and elegance. But it was the eyes that held Jonah captive, sharp, fiery, and unyielding, as if daring the world to try and break it. Jonah dismounted and stood silently, not wanting to startle the animal. He didn't move closer, he simply watched, taking in the raw beauty of a creature that seemed to embody freedom itself. Thunder noticed him, its ears twitching and muscles tensing as it turned to face the boy. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Jonah felt something he couldn't quite explain, a connection, fleeting but undeniable. "I won't hurt you," Jonah murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't expect the horse to understand, but saying it out loud felt important, like a promise to himself as much as to Thunder. The horse snorted and pawed at the ground, its body language cautious but not hostile. Jonah didn't push his luck. After a few minutes, he mounted Sage and began the long ride back to the ranch. But even as the familiar sights of home came into view, his mind remained with Thunder. Over the next few weeks, Jonah couldn't shake the memory of that encounter. He began spending his evenings riding out to the hills, always keeping a respectful distance. He brought small offerings, apples, carrots, even a bucket of fresh water, and left them in the same spot each time. At first, Thunder ignored them, but gradually, the horse began to approach, sniffing the treats cautiously before accepting them. It was slow, painstaking work, but Jonah didn't mind. In a way, it felt like he was building something, not just trust with Thunder, but a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Back at the ranch, Henry noticed the change in Jonah. The boy, once so withdrawn, was starting to show sparks of determination and focus. "You've been spending a lot of time out there," Henry remarked one evening as they sat on the porch. "What are you after?" Jonah hesitated, unsure how to explain. "I'm not sure," he admitted finally. "But it feels important." Henry studied him for a moment before nodding. "Just be careful. That horse isn't like the ones we keep here. It's wild. And wild things don't trust easy." "I know," Jonah said quietly. "But I think it's worth trying." The weeks turned into months, and Jonah's quiet persistence began to pay off. Thunder no longer bolted at the sight of him. The horse would linger nearby, watching Jonah with cautious eyes. One evening, Jonah sat cross-legged on the ground, a handful of carrots resting on his outstretched palm. To his amazement, Thunder stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, and took a carrot from his hand. For Jonah, that moment was more than a small victory. It was a spark of hope, a reminder that even the most guarded hearts could learn to trust again. Little did he know, this was just the beginning. The boy who had once felt invisible was about to embark on a journey that would test his patience, courage, and heart in ways he never imagined. And in the process, he would discover that sometimes, the most untamable spirits are the ones most in need of understanding. The days passed like a slow river, each one carrying Jonah closer to a decision he hadn't fully realized he was making. His visits to Thunder had become a ritual, a quiet escape from the noise of life at the ranch and the weight of his own unspoken struggles. But what had started as a simple curiosity was now something more, an unshakable resolve. Thunder wasn't just a wild horse to Jonah anymore. The creature's defiance, its unyielding spirit, mirrored his own in ways he couldn't ignore. Both had been scarred by life in ways that left them wary of others, and both were searching for something they couldn't find alone. But Thunder still kept a distance, and Jonah knew that trust wasn't something he could force. It would have to be earned, one small step at a time. The progress they'd made, Thunder taking a treat from his hand, lingering a little closer each time, felt like fragile victories, but victories nonetheless. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the hills in hues of gold and crimson, Jonah sat on the porch with his Uncle Henry. The older man was whittling a piece of wood, his hand steady despite the lines of age etched into his knuckles. "You've been spending a lot of time with that horse," Henry said, his tone casual but probing. Jonah nodded, staring out at the fading light. "Yeah," he replied softly. Henry set the wood and knife aside, leaning forward in his chair. "Jonah, you've got a good heart. But you're dealing with an animal that doesn't know how to trust. You can't fix everything, no matter how much you want to." Jonah's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the edges of his chair. "I'm not trying to fix him," he said after a moment. I don't know. I feel like I understand him. And maybe he needs someone to try." Henry sighed, his eyes filled with both pride and concern. "Just be careful," he said finally. A horse like that, one wrong move, and you'll end up with more than just bruises. Jonah nodded, but his heart was already set. He couldn't explain it, even to himself, but he knew that giving up wasn't an option. The following morning, Jonah rose before dawn, the chill of the early hours biting at his skin as he pulled on his boots and jacket. He packed a small bag with supplies, a few apples, some carrots, and a coil of soft rope. He didn't know what he planned to do, only that today felt different. As he saddled Sage and made his way toward the hills, the landscape felt both familiar and new. The soft morning light cast long shadows over the plains, and the air was thick with the scent of dew and earth. Jonah's heart pounded in his chest, a mixture of excitement and apprehension. When he reached the hilltop, Thunder was there, grazing near a cluster of wildflowers. The horse lifted its head as Jonah approached, its ears swiveling and nostrils flaring in alertness. Jonah dismounted slowly, keeping his movements calm and deliberate. "Hey there," he said softly, his voice carrying across the quiet field. "It's just me." He set down his bag a few feet away and sat cross-legged on the ground, pulling out an apple and holding it out on his open palm. Thunder watched him warily, its powerful muscles taut with readiness to bolt. But it didn't run. Minutes passed in silence, the only sound the rustling of the wind and the soft crunch of Jonah biting into his own half of the apple. Finally, Thunder stepped forward, its movements hesitant but purposeful. Jonah held his breath as the horse closed the distance, its fiery eyes locked on his. When Thunder took the apple from his hand, Jonah felt a surge of triumph unlike anything he'd ever experienced. But he knew better than to celebrate too soon. "That's it," he murmured, his voice steady and soothing. "You're okay." Thunder backed away, its movements still cautious, but it didn't retreat to the far edges of the field like it usually did. Instead, it lingered nearby, watching Jonah with an expression that almost seemed curious. For Jonah, that small moment was everything. It was a spark, a fragile connection that felt like the beginning of something far bigger. Over the next week, Jonah's visits grew bolder. He began carrying the soft rope in his bag, though he never attempted to use it. It wasn't about control, it was about familiarity. He would lay it on the ground while he fed Thunder, letting the horse sniff it, get used to its presence. Each interaction built on the last. Thunder grew more comfortable, stepping closer each time, allowing Jonah to brush his fingers lightly against its sleek coat. The sensation was electric, a tangible reminder of the progress they had made together. But not everyone saw the beauty in what Jonah was doing. One afternoon, as he returned to the ranch, a group of ranch hands cornered him near the stables. "You think you're special, kid?" one of them sneered, a burly man with calloused hands and a permanent scowl. "That horse has thrown every trainer who's tried to ride it. You're just asking to get hurt." Jonah met his gaze, his jaw set with quiet determination. "I'm not trying to ride him," he said evenly. "I'm trying to understand him." The man laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Well, good luck with that. You'll be lucky if you don't end up with a broken arm." Jonah didn't respond. He didn't need to. He knew what he was doing mattered, even if no one else understood. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast the plains in a warm, golden glow, Jonah made a decision. He packed his bag with an extra coil of rope and a blanket, knowing that tonight, he would take the next step. When he arrived at the hilltop, Thunder was waiting, its silhouette striking against the fiery sky. Jonah approached slowly, speaking softly as he always did. "All right, big guy," he murmured. "I'm not here to hurt you. But I think we're ready for something new." He laid the blanket over Thunder's back, his movements slow and deliberate. The horse tensed, its muscles rippling with unease, but Jonah didn't rush. "That's it," he said, his voice low and steady. "You're okay. We're in this together." The blanket stayed in place, and for the first time, Jonah felt the weight of possibility settle over him. He wasn't just connecting with Thunder, he was building a bridge between their worlds. As the stars began to dot the sky, Jonah sat by the corral, his heart full of hope and determination. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't giving up. The connection between Jonah and Thunder had grown steadily over the weeks, each moment a careful step forward. What started as a boy's quiet resolve to understand the untamable had become something more profound, a fragile trust that neither had experienced before. But trust is a delicate thing, and as Jonah knew, the moment he tried to take their bond to the next level, it could all come crashing down. He had thought about this day for weeks, replaying the scenario in his mind over and over. What if Thunder panicked? What if he moved too quickly and undid everything they had built? The questions were constant, but so was his determination. On a cool, overcast morning, Jonah made his way up to the familiar hilltop. This time, he wasn't just carrying apples and carrots, he had the soft rope coiled neatly in his bag, along with a lightweight bridle he had borrowed from the ranch. He had no intention of riding Thunder, not yet. Today's goal was simple but monumental: to slip the bridle over Thunder's head and take the first step towards something greater. As he approached the clearing where Thunder usually grazed, Jonah felt his heart pounding in his chest. The horse stood near a cluster of wildflowers, its copper coat gleaming even under the muted light of the cloudy sky. When Thunder lifted its head and saw him, there was no fear in its eyes, only a wary curiosity. "Hey, buddy," Jonah called softly, his voice steady despite the nerves coiling in his stomach. He kept his movements slow and deliberate as he set his bag down a few feet away and pulled out an apple, holding it out in his palm. Thunder approached cautiously, its ears flicking back and forth as it tested the air. When it finally took the apple from Jonah's hand, he let out a quiet breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "You're getting used to me, huh?" Jonah murmured, stroking Thunder's neck gently. The horse flinched slightly but didn't pull away. It was progress, small, steady, and hard-earned. Jonah spent the next 20 minutes letting Thunder acclimate to his presence, speaking in soft tones and moving with practiced patience. Finally, he reached into his bag and pulled out the rope, holding it loosely in one hand. "All right, big guy," he said, more to himself than to Thunder. "This is the part where we find out if you trust me." He extended the rope toward Thunder, letting it dangle in the air where the horse could see it clearly. Thunder's ears perked up, and it took a cautious step back, its nostrils flaring. "It's okay," Jonah said quickly, keeping his tone calm and soothing. "It's just rope. Nothing to be scared of." He placed the rope on the ground, a few feet in front of him, and stepped back. Thunder watched it warily, its muscles tense and ready to bolt. Minutes passed in silence as the horse seemed to weigh its options. Finally, it stepped forward, sniffing the rope cautiously before nudging it with its nose. Jonah smiled. "See? Nothing to it." He picked up the rope again, moving slowly, and held it out. This time, Thunder didn't back away. Jonah took another step forward, closing the distance between them, and gently draped the rope over Thunder's neck. The horse stiffened, its ears pinning back as it took a few uneasy steps to the side. Jonah kept his movement steady, his hands light and non-threatening. "You're okay," he murmured, stroking Thunder's neck with his free hand. "You're all right." Gradually, the tension in Thunder's body eased, and it stopped moving. Jonah let out a breath of relief, feeling a surge of hope. The real test came when Jonah reached for the bridle. As soon as he brought it into view, Thunder's ears flicked back, and it tossed its head, letting out a sharp snort. "It's all right," Jonah said, his voice low and even. "It's just me. You know me." He held the bridle out, letting Thunder sniff it, and waited. Patience had become his greatest tool, and he was determined to use it now more than ever. After what felt like an eternity, Thunder allowed him to slip the bridle over its head. Jonah moved with painstaking care, fastening the straps and adjusting them to fit comfortably. When it was done, he stepped back, giving Thunder plenty of space. The horse shook its head, clearly uncomfortable with the unfamiliar weight, but it didn't bolt. Jonah stood there, watching, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. "You're amazing," he whispered, a grin breaking across his face. "I knew you could do it." Thunder snorted, pawing at the ground as if to say, "Don't get ahead of yourself." Jonah spent the next hour letting Thunder adjust to the bridle, leading the horse gently around the clearing with the rope. The movements were slow and deliberate, each step a careful negotiation of trust. But just as Jonah began to feel a sense of accomplishment, the peaceful rhythm was shattered by a sudden, piercing sound, a loud clang of metal from the direction of the ranch. Thunder's reaction was immediate and explosive. The horse reared up, its powerful legs kicking the air as it let out a panicked whinny. Jonah's heart leapt into his throat as he scrambled to calm Thunder, his hands gripping the rope tightly. "Easy," he shouted, his voice firm but steady. "It's okay. I've got you." The horse's eyes were wild with fear, and for a terrifying moment, Jonah thought it would bolt and drag him along with it. But he stood his ground, holding the rope with steady hands and speaking in calm, reassuring tones. "Thunder, listen to me," he said, his voice trembling but determined. "You're okay. You're safe. I'm not going to let anything happen to you." Slowly, impossibly, Thunder began to calm down. Its breathing was heavy, its muscles trembling, but it stopped rearing and planted its hooves firmly on the ground. Jonah kept stroking its neck, murmuring soft words of encouragement until the tension in the horse's body finally began to ease. "You're all right," Jonah said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're both all right." By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, Thunder was back to grazing quietly, as though nothing had happened. Jonah sat nearby, his legs stretched out and his back resting against a tree. He felt utterly drained, but a small, triumphant smile tugged at the corners of his lips. Today had been a turning point, not just for Thunder, but for Jonah himself. He had faced the storm and come out the other side stronger, more sure of his ability to guide this incredible creature toward a brighter future. As he watched Thunder move gracefully through the clearing, Jonah felt a surge of gratitude. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. "This is just the beginning," he murmured, more to himself than to Thunder. "We've got a long way to go, but we'll get there. Together." The day Jonah slipped the bridle over Thunder's head had marked a shift in their journey together. It was a victory, fragile yet profound, earned through patience, resilience, and an unspoken understanding between boy and horse. But trust, Jonah knew, was not a one-time achievement. It was a thread, woven strand by strand, and one wrong move could unravel everything they had built. The events of that day, the clang of metal, Thunder's wild panic, and Jonah's desperate attempt to calm the horse, had left him both exhilarated and exhausted. He'd proven to himself that he could stand his ground, that he had the strength to face even the most chaotic moments. But as he sat by the fire that evening, his mind wandered to the challenges still ahead. Thunder wasn't just a horse, it was a symbol of something larger. For Jonah, it was a chance to prove not just to the world, but to himself, that he could be more than a quiet boy who blended into the background. He could be someone who mattered, someone who made a difference. The next morning, Jonah rose early, the pale light of dawn casting long shadows across the ranch. The air was crisp, and a faint mist clung to the hills. As he made his way toward the clearing where Thunder often grazed, he carried with him not just a bridle and rope, but a newfound sense of determination. Thunder was there, as he expected, standing amidst a cluster of wildflowers. The horse looked up as Jonah approached, its ears flicking forward in recognition. There was no panic in its movements, no fear in its eyes, only a cautious curiosity that Jonah had come to recognize as a sign of progress. "Morning, big guy," Jonah said, his voice steady and calm. He stopped a few feet away, giving Thunder the space it needed to feel safe. "Ready for the next step?" He pulled out an apple from his bag, holding it out on his open palm. Thunder stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, and took the apple without hesitation. Jonah smiled, a quiet satisfaction blooming in his chest. Over the next hour, Jonah worked on leading Thunder around the clearing, using the rope to guide the horse in gentle, controlled movements. Thunder responded well, its steps smooth and purposeful. It was a dance of trust, each movement a delicate balance of guidance and freedom. But Jonah knew that this was just the beginning. To truly bridge the gap between them, he would have to take things further. By midday, Jonah decided it was time to try something new. He led Thunder to a shaded spot near the edge of the clearing and set down his bag. From it, he pulled a soft, lightweight saddle, nothing too heavy or restrictive, just enough to get Thunder accustomed to the idea of carrying something on its back. Thunder watched him with wary eyes, its muscles tensing as Jonah approached with the saddle. "Easy," Jonah murmured, his voice calm and steady. "It's just me. You know I'm not going to hurt you." He let the saddle rest on the ground for a moment, giving Thunder a chance to sniff it. The horse hesitated but eventually lowered its head, its nostrils flaring as it examined the unfamiliar object. "That's it," Jonah said softly. "See? Nothing to be scared of." After a few minutes, he picked up the saddle and gently draped it over Thunder's back. The horse flinched, its ears pinning back, but it didn't bolt. Jonah moved slowly, securing the saddle straps with careful precision. "You're doing great," he said, his voice filled with quiet encouragement. "We're just taking it one step at a time." Thunder shifted uneasily, its hooves stamping at the ground, but Jonah stayed by its side, his hand resting lightly on the horse's neck. He could feel the tension in Thunder's body, the instinctive urge to flee, but he also felt the horse's growing trust, a fragile thread that held them together. The turning point came unexpectedly, as many pivotal moments do. As Jonah led Thunder around the clearing, the horse began to relax, its movements becoming more fluid and natural. For the first time, it seemed to accept the saddle as part of itself, rather than an alien intrusion. Jonah's heart swelled with pride and relief. "You're incredible," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But just as the moment of triumph settled over him, a sudden, sharp cry pierced the air, a hawk, swooping low over the clearing, its shadow streaking across the ground. Thunder's reaction was immediate and explosive. The horse reared up, its powerful legs striking the air as it let out a panicked whinny. The sudden movement caught Jonah off guard, and the rope slipped from his hands. "Thunder!" he shouted, his voice filled with both fear and desperation. The horse bolted, its hooves pounding against the earth as it galloped toward the open field. Jonah scrambled to his feet, his heart racing as he watched the horse's wild flight. He grabbed the rope and ran after Thunder, his boots slipping on the damp grass. His lungs burned, and his legs ached, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. "Thunder, stop," he called, his voice raw with emotion. "It's me. Jonah." To his astonishment, Thunder slowed, its ears flicking back as though it recognized his voice. The horse turned its head, its fiery eyes locking onto Jonah's. For a moment, they stood frozen, the distance between them feeling both vast and insignificant. Jonah took a step forward, then another, his movements slow and deliberate. He held out his hand, his palm open. "It's okay," he said, his voice trembling but steady. "I'm here. You're safe." Thunder pawed at the ground, its muscles tense and quivering, but it didn't run. Jonah closed the gap between them, his heart pounding as he reached for the rope. When his fingers closed around it, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Slowly, he stepped closer, his hand brushing against Thunder's neck. "You're all right," he murmured, his voice filled with both relief and gratitude. "We're both all right." By the time Jonah led Thunder back to the clearing, the sun was beginning to set, casting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The horse moved with a calmness that belied the chaos of moments earlier, its head lowered as though in quiet submission. Jonah removed the saddle, setting it aside, and spent the next hour simply sitting with Thunder, his hand resting gently on the horse's neck. The bond between them felt stronger now, forged in the fire of a shared crisis. For Jonah, the day had been more than a test of trust, it had been a revelation. Thunder wasn't just learning to trust him, Jonah was learning to trust himself. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jonah looked at Thunder, his heart full of hope and determination. "We did it," he said softly, a smile breaking across his face. "We made it through." Thunder snorted softly, its ears twitching as if in agreement. But Jonah knew their journey was far from over. This was just the beginning of something extraordinary, a partnership that would challenge them both to be better, braver, and stronger. Together, they were proving that even the wildest spirits could find a place to belong, and that trust, once earned, could overcome even the deepest fears. The evening air was cool as Jonah sat beside Thunder in the clearing, their silhouettes bathed in the silvery light of a full moon. The events of the day still lingered in his mind, the panic, the chase, and the fragile moment of trust that had held them together. It felt like they had crossed an invisible threshold, one that turned doubt into belief. For the first time, Jonah could see it clearly, the possibility of something extraordinary between them. But triumph wasn't a destination, it was a journey. Jonah knew that earning Thunder's trust was only the beginning. What lay ahead would test their bond in ways he could only begin to imagine. The following morning, Jonah awoke before dawn, his heart brimming with a quiet determination. Today, he would take the next step, one he had dreamed about but hadn't dared to attempt until now. Thunder was waiting in the clearing, its copper coat glowing softly in the morning light. Jonah approached with the same careful confidence he had built over weeks of patient effort. "Morning, big guy," he said, his voice calm but tinged with anticipation. He reached into his bag and pulled out the lightweight saddle, holding it up for Thunder to see. "We're trying this again, okay? Just you and me." Thunder's ears twitched, its muscles tightening slightly as Jonah placed the saddle over its back. The horse shifted uneasily but didn't resist, a testament to the progress they had made together. Jonah secured the straps with gentle precision, murmuring words of encouragement with every movement. Once the saddle was in place, Jonah stepped back, letting Thunder adjust. The horse tossed its head, its hooves stamping at the ground, but it didn't bolt. Jonah let out a breath of relief, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. "You're doing great," he said softly. "I knew you could handle this." After an hour of leading Thunder around the clearing with the saddle in place, Jonah decided it was time to try something more daring. His heart raced as he placed his foot in the stirrup and swung himself into the saddle. For a moment, Thunder froze, its muscles coiled like springs, ready to explode. Jonah's hands tightened on the reins, his voice steady and soothing. "Easy, Thunder," he said, leaning forward slightly. "I'm right here. You've got this." The horse shifted nervously, its head tossing and its hooves pawing at the dirt. Jonah held his breath, every muscle in his body tense as he waited for Thunder to make its decision, to trust or to run. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Thunder took a tentative step forward. Jonah's heart soared as the horse began to move, its steps cautious but steady. "That's it," Jonah murmured, a smile spreading across his face. "You're amazing, you know that." As they moved together through the clearing, Jonah felt a sense of freedom unlike anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't just about riding a horse, it was about the bond they had forged, the trust that had turned two broken souls into something whole. By midday, word had spread around the ranch. The workers, who had once mocked Jonah's efforts, gathered at the edge of the clearing, their expressions a mix of disbelief and admiration. Even Henry, who rarely showed emotion, stood with his arms crossed, his eyes filled with quiet pride. "Didn't think the kid had it in him," one of the workers muttered, shaking his head. Another nodded, his gaze fixed on Jonah and Thunder. "I'll be damned. That horse actually trusts him." Jonah paid no attention to the murmurs. His focus was entirely on Thunder, guiding the horse with gentle hands and quiet words. Every step they took together felt like a victory, a testament to the power of patience and understanding. When Jonah finally dismounted and led Thunder back to the makeshift corral, the crowd erupted into scattered applause. Jonah's face turned red, but he couldn't hide the smile that stretched across his lips. "You've come a long way, kid," Henry said as he approached. His voice was gruff, but there was a warmth in his eyes that Jonah had never seen before. "That horse isn't easy to handle. You've done something special here." Jonah shrugged, his hand resting on Thunder's neck. "It wasn't just me," he said quietly. "Thunder did the hard part." Henry chuckled, clapping Jonah on the shoulder. "Don't sell yourself short. You've got a gift, boy. Don't waste it." In the days that followed, Jonah and Thunder continued to train, each session building on the last. The bond between them grew stronger with every challenge they overcame, their trust in each other becoming unshakable. But triumph often attracts attention, and soon word of Jonah's progress with Thunder began to spread beyond the ranch. One afternoon, a man in a tailored suit arrived at the property, his polished boots crunching against the gravel as he stepped out of his shiny black car. Henry greeted him at the gate, his expression wary. "Can I help you?" The man adjusted his hat, his sharp eyes scanning the ranch. "I heard you've got a boy here who managed to tame a wild horse. Thought I'd come see it for myself." Henry frowned. "Who's asking?" "Name's Walter," the man said smoothly. "I represent a group that sponsors equestrian events. We're always on the lookout for promising talent." Henry's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Jonah appeared, leading Thunder out of the barn. Walter's eyes lit up as he took in the sight of the boy and the horse moving together with effortless grace. "This is him?" Walter asked, his tone tinged with disbelief. "He's just a kid." Henry crossed his arms. "That kid's done what no one else could." Walter approached Jonah, his polished demeanor suddenly eager. "You've got something special here, son," he said, his voice slick with charm. "A horse like that could take you far, competitions, sponsorships, maybe even championships. What do you say?" Jonah hesitated, his hand tightening on Thunder's reins. The idea of competing, of showing the world what they had accomplished, was tempting. But the thought of putting Thunder through the pressures of a public spotlight left a sour taste in his mouth. "I'll think about it," he said finally, his tone polite but firm. Walter smiled, handing Jonah a crisp business card. "Take your time. But don't wait too long, opportunities like this don't come around every day." That evening, Jonah sat by the fire, the card resting in his palm. He turned it over, reading the elegant print, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He glanced at Thunder, who stood grazing nearby, its movements calm and content. "What do you think?" Jonah murmured, his voice soft. "Do we take a chance and show the world what we can do? Or do we stay here, where it's safe?" Thunder lifted its head, its fiery eyes locking onto Jonah's. For a moment, it felt as though the horse understood the weight of the decision. Finally, Jonah slipped the card into his pocket and stood. "No matter what, we'll do it our way," he said, his voice steady with resolve. "We've come this far together. Nothing's going to change that." The next morning, Jonah saddled Thunder and rode out to the hills, the cool breeze carrying the promise of a new day. As they moved together across the open plains, Jonah felt a sense of freedom and purpose he had never known before. Jonah rode back to the ranch with Thunder, their shadows stretching long across the golden plains as the sun dipped lower in the sky. The weight of Walter's offer lingered in his mind, a quiet hum of possibility and uncertainty. Competing with Thunder was a tempting idea. The thought of proving to the world what they had accomplished together stirred something deep within him. Yet, he couldn't ignore the voice in his heart, the one that whispered caution. That night, as the stars blanketed the sky and the ranch fell quiet, Jonah sat on the fence near Thunder's corral. The horse grazed peacefully under the moonlight, its copper coat gleaming like liquid fire. Jonah rested his chin on his hands, watching the animal that had become more than just a companion. Thunder was a part of him now, a living, breathing symbol of resilience, trust, and the bond they had fought so hard to create. "Do we take the leap?" Jonah murmured, his voice barely audible. "Do we show the world what we've done, or do we stay here, just you and me?" Thunder lifted its head, its dark eyes locking onto Jonah's. The boy chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You don't have the answers either, huh?" The next morning, Jonah awoke with a sense of clarity. Whatever decision he made, it would be on his terms. Thunder's well-being would always come first. As he saddled the horse for their daily ride, Henry approached, his expression unreadable. "You've been quiet," Henry said, leaning against the barn door. "You thinking about that man's offer?" Jonah nodded, his hands working the leather straps with practiced ease. "Yeah. I don't want to lose what we've got. Thunder's been through so much already. I don't want to push him too far." Henry studied him for a moment, then stepped closer, his hand resting on Jonah's shoulder. "You've done something incredible here," he said, his voice softer than usual. "But life's about taking risks. If you think this is worth it, don't let fear hold you back. Just remember, the world out there can be tough. Protect what matters." Jonah nodded, Henry's words sinking deep into his heart. He glanced at Thunder, who stood calmly beside him, waiting for the day's adventure. "I'll protect him," Jonah said quietly. "No matter what." Days turned into weeks as Jonah and Thunder continued their training, preparing for the possibility of stepping into the competitive world. Walter's offer hadn't been a fleeting moment. The man was persistent, returning several times with promises of sponsorships, exposure, and success. Each visit tested Jonah's resolve, but it also gave him time to make peace with his choice. One crisp morning, Jonah made his decision. He saddled Thunder and rode out to the hills, the wind tugging at his jacket and the horizon stretching endlessly before them. He didn't know what the future would bring, but he knew he couldn't turn away from the opportunity to show the world what they had achieved together. Back at the ranch, Walter stood near his car, his polished shoes gleaming against the dirt. When Jonah dismounted and approached, the man's face broke into a confident smile. "Well, son?" Walter asked, extending his hand. "Have you made up your mind?" Jonah looked at him, then at Thunder, who stood tall and proud, its fiery spirit undiminished. Taking a deep breath, Jonah shook Walter's hand. "We'll do it," he said firmly. "But on my terms. Thunder comes first, always." Walter's smile faltered for a moment before he nodded. "Fair enough," he said, his tone smooth. "You won't regret this." The weeks leading up to the competition were a whirlwind of preparation. Jonah and Thunder trained tirelessly, refining their movements and strengthening their bond. Henry and the ranch hands pitched in, offering advice, encouragement, and occasionally some good-natured teasing. "You're gonna show those city folks what real grit looks like," Pedro, one of the ranch hands, said with a grin. Jonah smiled, his confidence growing with each passing day. For the first time, he felt ready, not just for the competition, but for the challenge of stepping into a larger world. The day of the competition arrived, and the air buzzed with energy as competitors, spectators, and judges filled the arena. Jonah and Thunder stood at the edge of the field, their presence drawing curious glances and hushed whispers. "That's the boy who tamed the untamable horse," someone murmured. "Think he's got what it takes?" another voice asked. Jonah ignored the noise, his focus entirely on Thunder. He stroked the horse's neck, his voice steady and reassuring. "It's just you and me, buddy. We've got this." The starting bell rang, and Jonah guided Thunder onto the track. The crowd's murmur swelled into a roar, but Jonah blocked it out, his attention locked on the course ahead. Thunder moved with a grace and power that turned heads, its every step a testament to the bond they shared. As they navigated the course, Jonah felt an overwhelming sense of pride. Each turn, each jump, and each stride was a victory, not just in the competition, but in the journey that had brought them here. The connection between boy and horse was undeniable, their movements in perfect harmony. When they crossed the finish line, the crowd erupted into applause. Jonah dismounted, wrapping his arms around Thunder's neck. The horse exhaled sharply, its fiery eyes meeting Jonah's with a quiet understanding. "We did it," Jonah whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You were incredible." The judge's decision was announced soon after. Jonah and Thunder didn't take first place, but their performance had left an impression. They were awarded a special recognition for their remarkable bond and the trust they had built, a moment that felt more meaningful than any trophy. Walter approached them as the crowd began to disperse, his smile wide. "You've got a future in this, son," he said. "This is just the beginning." Jonah nodded, his hand resting on Thunder's mane. "It's not about the trophies," he said quietly. "It's about what we've built together." Walter studied him for a moment before tipping his hat. "You've got your priorities straight, kid. Keep it that way." As the sun set over the arena, Jonah and Thunder stood on a hill overlooking the field. The golden light bathed them in warmth, and for a moment, the world felt still and perfect. Jonah leaned against Thunder, his heart full of gratitude and hope. "We've come so far," he murmured. "And we're just getting started." Thunder snorted softly, its ears twitching as if in agreement. Together, boy and horse gazed out at the horizon, their bond unbreakable and their spirits untamed. They didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but they knew one thing for certain: as long as they had each other, they could face anything. Their journey wasn't just about triumphs or victories, it was about the unyielding power of trust, the beauty of resilience, and the strength to keep moving forward, no matter what.